Hello, everyone. It's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is a book club episode presented by your brothers in Christ, Nick and Peter, from the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast. We bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. As a reminder, as always, check out our show notes after listening to today's episode. We are today interviewing Dr. Peter Lillback on the book Things Unseen, A Systematic Introduction to the Christian Faith and Reformed Theology, J Gresham Machen. It's published by Westminster Seminary Press, and there's a foreword, preface, introduction, and afterword by Sinclair Ferguson, Stephen J. Nichols, who we've had on the show before, Timothy Keller, and Richard Gaffin Jr. So this book is really great because it's going to introduce you guys to J Gresham Machen, who is someone, as you'll learn here in a few minutes, very important in the Reformed Christian theology in fairly recent times, but much more is talked about in this book, in this very unique, incredible book. As a reminder about the links in our show notes, one of our links is to the Network of Society of Reformed Podcasters. There's also another couple links to find a Reformed church near you if you need a biblically focused church to call home. That link is the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Churches, which includes the PCA, URC, OPC, among others. And of course, we have another link for Baptist brothers and sisters out there for you as well. So for today's book club, we're honored and thankful to have Dr. Peter Lillback, and he'll be talking to us about the brand new book from Westminster Seminary Press called Things Unseen.
Yeah, we have Dr. Peter Lillback, PhD from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He's the president and professor of historical theology and church history at Westminster Theological Seminary. Also serves as president emeritus and founder of Providence Forum, senior editor of the new Unio Cum Christo. It's a journal of Reformed theology and life. He has a couple of books out on John Calvin, but we're specifically talking to him because he's the president of Westminster Theological Seminary, and he's on the line after John Gresham Machen, who wrote this book after these radio addresses. We're excited to talk to somebody who has some sort of link to Dr. Machen. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Lillback.
Thank you, Brother Peter and Nick. What a pleasure to be with you. I'm here in Philadelphia, and the greetings to all the folks on the other side of the country and probably around the world now, since this podcast must go everywhere.
Yep, it does. Yeah, it's probably, I think we hit 70 countries not too long ago. So it's
that's fabulous.
It's reaching the masses. So we're excited to do this.
Yep.
Well, that's good. It's an honor to be with you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
So this book is very unique, as I was kind of mentioning before, in the way it's written and read and laid out. But I think we would have to start this off by introducing the audience to who J Gresham Machen, John Gresham Machen is, why he was so important. Maybe just kind of, since you filled his shoes and you're now in his position at Westminster, maybe you can explain to the audience who he was and why it's so important in 2021 to have a book written about him.
Well, very good. Well, let me begin by saying that I really don't fill his shoes. As the founder, prophet, leader, professor of the seminary, no one can quite take his place. Right. In fact, when Westminster started, the vision was for a faculty-run institution. And so there wasn't even a president. It was he was just the founder with the faculty. Yeah. And so we like to think of our first president as a man by the name of Edmund Clowney, who came around maybe 30 or 40 years later to become the first president. So I'm president number 4 following. I only carry the water for J Gresham Machen. So you got to get that right. I'm the water boy.
Yeah, like the John the Baptist is unfit to tie the sandals of Jesus.
There's tremendous parallels there. So as we think about Machen, we need to remember he was a very gifted linguist. He his book on New Testament Greek is still used to this day in various schools. It's a classic on teaching biblical Greek. He was someone who had served as a pacifist in World War I, but wanted to support his country and ministry. So he went with the YMCA to do humanitarian work with soldiers on the front. So there's a book that Westminster has published called Letters from the Front that talk about his writing back and forth to home during that time. But what is his significant role was early on as a young professor, he saw the drift toward modernist liberal theology, and he came to the conclusion that it was not historic Christianity. And he had the daring to publish a book called Christianity and Liberalism and say there are two different religions.
Yeah.
So by writing that book, he created a firestorm of opposition where they're saying, you mean I'm not a Christian because I'm a liberal? He says, yes, that's true, because you deny the Bible, you deny Christ, you deny the resurrection, you've lost the historic tenets of the Christian faith. Well, that debate moved along until what became known as the reorganization of Princeton Theological Seminary, where they required that the board had to represent the theological breadth of the denomination. And at that moment, Machen said, well, then Princeton is the historic bastion of old Presbyterianism, the classic theology of B.B. Warfield and the confessional forefathers of the Westminster divines. He said, that's all gone. It's time to start a new seminary. And so what he did, he moved across the Delaware River to Philadelphia from Princeton and set up in a brownstone house a new seminary. And a handful of professors, outstanding Princetonians, came along with him. So that made Westminster really unique because they had world-class professors starting right from the beginning. And what they had at the same time was the commitment that they would not charge any tuition for the students. If you got accepted, you got world-class Princeton professors who were Orthodox teaching you theology. And so right from the beginning, Westminster was destined to make an impact because of its unique beginning and faculty and its calling. Well, then to round out the story of Machen, because he was a reformer and wanting to keep biblical Christianity front and center, he noticed how the missionaries that were going out from the Presbyterian Church were no longer clear about the gospel. They were becoming humanitarians. The famous book, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which makes universalism really the heart of religion. He said, this cannot be the kind of religious missionaries we send out. So he had the daring to start a new mission board called the Independent Board of Foreign Missions. Well, that got him in trouble because now he was attacking the mission work of the denomination. Eventually he was defrocked without ever a hearing all the way to General Assembly. And he was compelled by necessity to say, what do I do? I feel like I'm being faithful to the gospel, and a new church was planted. It ultimately became what we know today as the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And sadly, Machen died very quickly after that. New Year's Day, 1937, I believe, is the year where he passed away. So a new church, a new seminary, and a classic book along with other writings. And what we're going to talk about today are radio addresses that he had given. So that's the man we're talking about.
Yeah, he's an incredible guy. And it's crazy to think of how much he accomplished and kind of how hated he was his last 10 years of life. And he still accomplished all this stuff, founded a seminary, founded a denomination, wrote prolifically, all the while his former denomination's trying to take him down.
That's right. So when you hear the name of Machen, he's the kind of person you either love or hate. There's no neutrality about him.
No.
Because he was so incisive in his analysis, a brilliant thinker with words that were precise, and he was willing to stand for what was being compromised and abandoned. And so as a result, he created a following and also a real opposition. So if we want to think about it today, that when you hear the word liberal applied to a denomination, you're really hearing a footnote to Machen's debate. He gave us that vocabulary. Now, political liberalism, I tend to think is a good thing. And Machen was a political liberal. That is free speech, the ability of conscience, the individual. But when you apply it to theology that says we're free from the Bible, I don't have to listen to it, it's my own ideas, that kind of liberalism Machen would say is a death knell to the church. The gospel will be lost. You've abandoned Christianity. And so we use that word, and most of us don't even know that's Machen still at work in our lives.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sounds like you definitely answered the part of that question too, that it was why it's so important in 2021. I mean, it's just as important now. The apologetics for the Bible against Christian liberalism. There's a lot of counterfeit Christianity out there that we are currently fighting against, right? So this book, and reminder of his talks and what he brought to the table, really in apologetics for what the Bible says and stands for, really is very applicable today.
Yeah.
So
when you read Machen, you have this sense that you're dealing with something that could be happening right now.
Yeah, I was about to say that. You're reading his addresses 80 years ago. Like, this could have been written yesterday.
I've had people say to me, wow, I've just read this book. It's describing my church. And I say, well, Machen wrote that about 100 years ago almost now.
Yeah, it's insane how still clear and concise and poignant he is today.
So the word timeless and theology come together in Machen. He was very engaged with his day. I mean, he was talking about issues of culture, making the front page of the New York Times by his actions and all of that sort of thing. But when he writes, when he speaks, as the book title says, he wanted to speak of things unseen, the eternal realm. And eternity is always relevant when it breaks into time. So that's Machen's desire.
Yeah, I love it.
So that's how we got the title of the book. And just how the context of the book is written, what I enjoyed about it, and I think the audience would agree, is before you get into the heart of the book, each of the chapters, and I'll let you describe what they are. There's the introduction, preface, and that kind of thing, with Nichols and Keller, and it's really explaining who Machen was, the background of him, when he was growing up, his experience at Princeton, opening up Westminster and the OPC, that kind of thing, even up to his death. But could you break down for us maybe how the book is written, the actual context of, there's original scripts, his talks are really each chapter, and how it's actually best read by the reader, how it's recommended in the book to read, and anything extra unique or special that you can kind of put in there about how this book is put together for the audience.
So basically, when you have a book that's written from scratch, it has a certain form because an author knows you're reading the words on the page and they're there. When Machen gave these, he was somewhere in between a classroom lecture and a Sunday sermon. He was not preaching per se, but he was delivering theological work, but it was oral. And so the oral character of his talk is still preserved. You can almost hear him speaking to you, in his voice, which is a fun way. It's a suspended animation of radio broadcasts. Yeah. You're listening to him. So that's a nice feature. Further, they're broken up in the segment of what a programming length would be. So the chapters are consistently the same, and they have a wonderful ring on their own merit. So each one is holistic. And so I think the way to read it is to read maybe one a day and just enjoy, I'm listening to Machen's broadcast today. And just it's an easy way to go through. And you'll find the excellencies of his logic, of his speaking, and his spiritual application, plus his passion comes through, his love for Christ and theology. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the structure is that the first book, or if you will, the first series of talks when Machen started, he assumed he was speaking to an audience that included believers and unbelievers because it was a public radio program published by Westminster Seminary, but it was one of the early radio stations in Philadelphia. And so he made the assumption, I'm just talking to people that maybe know nothing about God, nothing about the Bible, or maybe they do, but they really have never thought about having a serious look at it. So if you will, it was kind of like your podcast, trying to take complex ideas and really make them available for the man in the street.
Mhm.
So you guys are in the Machen spirit, whether you realize it or
There we
not.
go.
So his first book, his first talks really have an evangelistic ring, making a point of contact with people. And he's consciously following the confession where it starts with, well, what is the Bible? Who is God? What do we believe about the Trinity and Revelation and the Holy Spirit? And is Christ really God? The foundational questions that are at the core of Reformed theology, but are not distinctively Reformed. This is what historic Christianity has all dealt with one way or another. And so he's laying the foundation. When he comes to the second book, which is really his view of man, we're now moving from outside Christianity to basic Christian ideas to inside Christianity, which is within the church. There are people now who have different views of sin, different views of salvation, different views of grace. You get the word Arminian and you get the word Calvinist, predestination and free will. So because he's dealing theologically, he's moving now from the broader introductory topics that establish a Christian worldview now to the things that become the intramural debates within the kingdom of God. And he wants to be able to say there's points of contact between Arminians and Calvinists, but we really disagree about big issues. And now he's wanting to do the same thing. He's saying, if you're listening with me, I want to talk to you about these items. So now it's not that evangelism disappears, because he never forgets he's still talking to all sorts of people out there. But he's now beginning to talk to people, wonder, well, what really is the difference between an Arminian and a Calvinist, a Presbyterian and a Methodist, a Catholic who is trying to wrestle with the Bible, and a real Reformed person who believes in biblical authority? Those are issues that are at the core of his thinking. So that helps to explain the two different books. They're logical sequences of systematic theology applied to a broader audience.
There we go.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's great, because it's almost like it's like common talk. It's like your grandpa walking over to you, sitting at the next chair, and just describing the faith to you, and then getting deeper and deeper and deeper as he goes along.
That's good.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. The logical sequence. I couldn't have said it any better, because that's how I felt like when Tim Keller started opening up the book, and he explained exactly what you're saying in the introduction, how it starts off more generally talking to maybe non-believers, or even explaining Christianity generally in the Bible, and then it goes down. It as you go along, it gets more towards explaining the Reformed doctrine. So it is a logical sequence of how one would learn this stuff. And
let me add this thought here, is that Machen was initially hired by Princeton Seminary for apologetics. That was the role that they wanted. And so in the classic Princetonian apologetic, there was the desire to expound the faith and defend the faith. And so his method of apologetics is, when you expound the faith truly, you're defending it. And as you're going through, you're anticipating objections that people have, and you are unpacking those objections honestly and fairly. You're taking people's criticisms or beliefs, and you're taking it apart. So that logical and biblically based method is a form of a historic, positive expression of apologetics. Teach the faith well, and you're defending it in its best form.
Yeah, and maybe to add a tiny little bit too, it's different than most Reformed systematic theologies that you would read, whether it be Berkhoff or Bavinck, or if you read Horton, you read somebody else who wrote a systematics, or Calvin. There's kind of an implicit assumption that you're already Reformed, or you have some sort of categories, versus this one is Reformed systematic, but it starts from the very, 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 very beginning, and then brings you through, and then gets deeper and deeper. So it doesn't assume that you're Reformed coming in, which I think is a great way to start.
That's good. That's why it really is a good primer for the Reformed faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, getting a little bit more detailed into the strategic method behind the structure of laying out the book. There is 3 parts. There's part one, which is the Christian faith in the modern world. And then part two is the Christian view of man. And then part three is the final broadcasts. Can you maybe give the audience a little bit more understanding of those particular layouts of those categories?
Yeah, so Machen was asked to do this work by a board member by the name of Edwin Ryan, who was very much a recruiter and fundraiser for the seminary in its early years. And he recognized that a new seminary needed to get its brand name out there. And so they thought through the best way to do it. And Machen said, okay, I will do this radio program and we'll use it to share the faith that we hold. And it didn't start out as a distinctive Westminster broadcast. It was really just Christian teaching. But as he moves in the later parts of the book, in his second book, as he's doing it more, now the theological distinctives of the Reformed faith, it becomes more evident that this is connected with Westminster. I think it could have been that I could imagine Edwin Ryan was saying, please say more about the seminary. We need to get more friends.
Yeah.
So Machen not only accepted the duty to do this, an opportunity, but also began to do some marketing to make the message more relevant, because he knew he was looking for funders as well as students, as well as ministry, all legitimate tasks of a seminary leader. So we also know in the introduction of the book, Machen tells us that John Murray was one of the advisors that he had with him. So he had this young biblical theologian, systematic theologian, speaking into helping him to structure things in a way. So all of that is going on. And as we move toward the very end, we are now at the stage in Machen's life where there are many struggles that are coming to a head. He has been spending his life trying to start a new seminary and defend the faith. He started a new mission board. He has lost his position in the church. A new denomination is formed. And there are even some controversies, as often happens in a new movement, that have to be addressed. And so he is stretched in every possible way, and he's still wanting to minister and carry on this work. So the reason that we come to book 3 with such a short amount is that his candle has been burned on both sides and it's coming to its end. He is compelled to go in his conscience to help some new church plants up in the Dakotas that needed attention. And his friend said, don't go, you're exhausted. And he said, I have to go. So he had done some of the talks that were going to be prepared. And that's why there's so few at the end, because he ends up going, he contracts pneumonia and he dies on New Year's Day, 1937. So he's not able to finish book 3. But what he was clearly beginning to do is develop more the theological distinctives of the Reformed faith a la Westminster and its movement, the church. And that would have been the direction he would have continued to go, because he was honing in, but he was not able to finish that. And so we all are mindful of the remarkable last words that he has. He sent a telegram back to his friends in Philadelphia as he's dying. No, his friends are far away. You remember, in those days, there's no airplane that easily takes you from point A to point B. Yeah. He's in the Dakotas dying of pneumonia, and his telegram says, thanks to God for the active obedience of Christ. There's no hope without it. In other words, he's thinking theologically, and that is the last topic, basically, of his radio talks. He was thinking about what he was delivering, and on his deathbed, he's saying, Christ has fulfilled all the law for us. That's why there's any hope for our righteousness. I can't get my job done. You can hear the sense of, I'm dying. I have so much to do and no time left. But thanks be to God, it's not me getting everything done. It's that Christ has done it all for me. His righteousness is imputed to me, received by faith, his act of obedience. He bore the curse for me. And of course, all those things become part of the blessing of what we're talking about here. So book 3 is cut short, and that's just the way God in his providence had it be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we touched on this a little bit before, so I apologize if the answer is redundant, but I think it's super important that it's clear what who his primary audience was. So based on a lot of his published material. So we went into, he speaks to a lot of lay people, the masses, general people, but also people in churches, maybe even other Reformed people. So that would be kind of maybe re-understanding that. Could you go into that a little bit more?
So this is part of the unique giftedness that we have in Machen as a scholar. Imagine he can write a textbook on learning New Testament Greek. That means you have to be a master of that language to be able to teach it to beginners and make sense of it. He's able to write scholarly tomes. We haven't talked about these, the origin of Paul's religion, all the great questions of what we call biblical introduction to the New Testament. How did Paul's theology come about? What is its historical milieu? How did it shape it with other religions and things? He wrote one of the greatest defenses ever of the virgin birth of Christ, which was one of the things attacked by theological liberalism. And so he grounds it in theological, historical, biblical narrative and defends it. So here he's able to do theological students, theological liberals. He writes the book that thinking people about the church would take on, which is Christianity and liberalism. What is the true thing? But having been able to look at all of these audiences, now he's looking at the untouched audience of the city of Philadelphia and any place his voice might go. And he's starting right at the beginning, like an apologist. And then, but as an apologist, he's mindful that even unbelievers who need to hear these things are very similar to believers who are starters. They have the same questions. If God is really there, then who is he? I believe in him, and so he's going down, if you will, to the Sunday school level, the basic beginning, and to the unbeliever. And then because he's a good pedagogical thinker, he's beginning as he goes through his books to build upon each thought so that he's taking you along, and he's now in a discipleship course. It's a discipleship course. If you're listening in, whether you're a believer or not, he's remembering not everybody is. So in that sense, these works are Machen remembering the fact that while he's a theologian in a highly scholarly world, he's also a Christian in a world where there are many people in the church and outside the church that do not know the basics of the treasures of the faith, and he wants to teach them too. That's the kind of pastor I hope Westminster is producing today, and that churches have. Someone who can deal with the high intellectual problems that come in theology, and they know what they believe, but they don't stay there. They come down, they're not afraid to talk about the very beginning things with the new believer, or they have a time of building over years with the congregation, helping them to mature to become, if you will, lay theologians, people who can handle the word of God and handle the confession. So he really is, in my opinion, the master teacher. He knows his audience, he knows his material, and then he focuses what he has to say, what's relevant for them without compromising his message. So he's really an extraordinary teacher in that regard.
Yeah, he's a world-class scholar who, at the same time, when he's talking to those who are learning about the faith, who are interested, and those who know something about the faith, they're still upbuilt, but he never forgets those who come from outside the church who have no idea. So he beautifully weaves these in throughout this book.
Yeah. So forgive the analogy, but I'll offer it this way. If you try to get a heart of what Reformed architecture is aesthetically, sometimes it's been called profound simplicity. There's something majestic, but it's very, very simple.
Yeah.
Well, when a great theologian is teaching, there's profound simplicity. You get what they're talking about, but you realize there's so much more that you're reaching for, and you never can get it all, and you want to know more.
Yeah.
So that the aesthetics of our theology and the aesthetics of our architecture go hand in hand. And Machen clearly had that ability to be profound and simple at the same time that makes you come back and say, I want to keep learning from this man.
Yeah, it's almost like he hit two birds with one theological stone.
Or hit many, many, many birds with one.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, he's ridiculous. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but just to kind of fine print. So he not only founded with a couple other professors Westminster Theological Seminary, also the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, wrote a bunch of scholarly work. So he's not just, and not saying you can't be just a churchman, but he's a churchman, he's a theologian, he's an author. I mean, is this something like that was kind of bred into him? Is this like, was this his like what created this passion, if you can kind of summarize this concisely in Machen, to be all of this for his listeners?
Well, I think we can even add another dimension. He was on the forefront of what today we've come to call public theology. He was taking issues of the state, talking about education and the concern about the required public education, taking away the education of children by parents, state laws. So he was concerned even about the public square, which is an interesting point. But if you look at Machen, what made him uniquely what he was is that, first of all, he was a precocious child and a unique talent. God endowed him with certain gifts that all of us don't get to have.
Yeah.
He also had a very godly mother and a scholarly father. His father was an accomplished lawyer. His mother really worked hard to help him develop a highly committed catechetical understanding of the Reformed faith. So he grew up with a lot of serious training. And so at home, I think there was a lot of scholarly encouragement to learn the original languages of Latin and Greek. He went to Johns Hopkins and he was graduated at the top of his class. So he was a really very, very diligent student.
Yeah.
And he had a master's degree in theology and philosophy. So he had studied very carefully. And then he did doctoral studies in Europe right at the heyday of the great Protestant liberal theologians. Yeah. So he knew if you want to say it this way, he was in the lion's den of unbelief within the church. That was the heyday of that movement. And what's fascinating is that Machen communicates very clearly that he was really challenged by the fact that his professors in Europe seemed to be such godly men, such good men, and yet had such radical disbelief in the Bible that he wondered, well, do you really need Christianity to be good? Maybe Christianity is not true. And so he wrestled with all of those things. And my understanding is, he said that what kept him from going off the deep end of Protestant liberalism is something like you hear in St. Augustine. It was my mother's prayers. That my mother's love for Christ that she imbued into me kept me grounded in the things and kept me coming back to, what do I really believe? What is the truth? And so I just want to remind all the ladies that are out there raising children now, your theological training of your children may impact a generation you'll never get to see.
Interesting, yeah.
And we don't know how important that is. And Augustine and Machen both say, thank God for godly mothers. And that's part of, so the home education in some ways maybe even more strategic in the long run than a seminary education, but I'm not against seminary education.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously. Yeah, that's a good word. That's a good word for, I mean, a lot of different people and a lot of women, I'm assuming, who are just, especially the last year or so when things have been so rough, to be faithful. And that's, like you said, this is a huge call, and not just your child will one day be Dr. Machen, but it's their impact is just as strong as Machen's impact too.
Well, I can't psychoanalyze the dead, so forgive me for even saying this, but let's just assume there's a modicum of truth in what I'm about to say. Had Machen come from a different family, his brilliance could have made him an egghead that had no interest in anybody but scholars. What happened in his life? He clearly was grounded in his home to love others that were not as advanced and skilled and talented. And he didn't forget that. And that's what comes out in these radio talks. And I think that today we'd call that an EQ along with an IQ.
Yeah. He
had an emotional quotient that said, I have to care about those that don't know what I know. And it's not for me that I know them. To whom much is given, much is required. And so he was committed to advancing the faith far beyond just the scholarly community. And I think that is also a great reminder is for our seminarians who might be listening in today. Remember, your value is to your congregation. And the reason your value is so great is because of all the things you've learned that makes you a unique leader. It's both ends. The scholar pastor is the ideal. In that sense, while Machen never was a pastor, in these talks, he was becoming a pastor to his city. He was trying to reach out to them as a professor, a scholar, caring for the needs of those who didn't know and needed to grow.
Yeah. So last two questions, kind of wrapping this stuff up. I mean, just an incredible interview on Dr. Machen. So what kind of footprint has Dr. Machen left, not just on the Presbyterian Church in particular, Reformed theology in particular, but what kind of legacy for Christians as a whole has Dr. Machen left?
I think we can look at his legacy in both a positive and a critical way. And I'm trying to reflect what people have said.
Yeah.
That in the positive way, many could easily argue the reason that there is a biblically based, relevant, reformed ecclesiastical movement today, it's because Machen helped preserve the last vestige of what was there of it at Princeton that was getting ready to destroy it.
Yeah.
It was becoming just total Protestant liberalism. And he said, no, we're going to keep this legacy going and alive. And so to the fact that there's a Westminster, Philadelphia, a Westminster, California, a Reformed Theological Seminary network of schools, others in the Reformed legacy, that is somehow a footnote to Machen's commitment. He kept that movement alive and with a theological integrity. So that is a great legacy.
Yeah.
The legacy of the church, whether it's the OPC or the PCA, both of them recognize a real commitment to Machen's churchmanship and a church that's faithful to Scripture, confessional in character, and at its best, doing radio talks like Machen did, getting the word out to the public square and to the society. Those are legacies. Now, where we might say that we can criticize, and the scholars have done this, and as well as members of his church, that when a person comes out of a battle for the fundamentals, as it became known, the fundamentals of the faith, fundamentalism has the danger of being reduced to the things you debate about. What are the fundamentals? This is what we're fighting about, and that's all we talk about. Now, Machen didn't want to be called a fundamentalist. He wanted to be called a confessional Presbyterian. He says, you can't reduce my views to the 5 fundamentals of the faith. We need to have the confession and the full order of biblical teaching. But when you are in that movement, which he was part of, addressing the issues of the day, and the fundamentalist documents came out, he became known as one of the fundamentalists. And in a sense he was, but in another sense he said, that's not what I want to be identified as. So those of us that follow in the Machen legacy will always have to deal with the epithet of, you're just a fundamentalist, in other words, which has changed its meaning through the years. Today it means you're radically committed and you have no brain.
Yeah.
For Machen, he was radically committed and he had a brain bigger than almost anybody. So it doesn't fit. So that's one. Another part is sometimes we've heard it in the words of a popular study called Machen's Warring Children. In other words, he gave us a legacy of fighting theologians, fighting fundamentalists in some people's minds, or the people that are contending for the faith and that were, let's say, on the attack, that were causing problems, want to debate. There's always a danger of that too. When you stand for truth, it's going to create a wake. You're going to be dividing things because of movement. But I think Francis Schaeffer, who is somebody who was deeply in the Machen tradition, who loved Machen and got moved to do his work. I remember him saying so clearly at one point in his ministry, let us never forget how Paul puts together in Ephesians 4, truth and love. Speak the truth in love. And so one of the things that we need to have when we follow Machen's example is that we not only have the truth side of it, but we also have the love side of it, of ministry, which is what these radio addresses and Things Unseen does. It says we love our neighbor. We want them to know the truth, want to care for them.
Yeah.
So it's like anything. If you have a tool or a weapon, it can be deadly or it can be constructive, depending how you use it. So Machen's legacy has been used both ways. It's not to be triumphalistic. It's to be establishing the truth and then ministering for the sake of the gospel. So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, that's good. And with some of that background too, and some of the books you've talked about, if there's, so one of them is Christianity and Liberalism that Machen wrote about 100 years ago. Is there anything else that you can recommend for our listeners, if people listening, to read about Machen, or is there future works like this that are coming on in Machen? Is there anything that's coming up that's helpful in this line?
Okay, well, there's a couple things that I can say. One is the classic original biography of Machen was done by Ned Stonehouse, one of the professors he brought. That's a classic to read. We've had others that have been developed through the years. For example, we have Steve Nichols, who's one of the endorsers of this book and wrote the preface. He's written one.
Okay.
There are other great scholars who have done lots of work in that. So that those are available for your reading that might be useful. But I also think we're hoping Westminster Seminary Press will, in fact, be producing sometime in the next few years the collected writings of J Gresham Machen. So if you want to have all of his articles, all of his great writings in one place, that is destined to appear in the right time. If you want probably the most scholarly treatment of Machen's life, Darrell Hart wrote a classic book that is on Machen. So I would say the original is Stonehouse, the most scholarly is Hart, and the most popular reader is Nichols. So that those would all be worth reading if you want to pursue it. Other things that will be coming out in Machen, we'll have to see. We have some possible other thoughts, but Westminster did produce, when the copyright disappeared on Christianity and Liberalism, it's now in the public domain. Anybody can print it. We did a collected essay of all of our faculty and issued a Westminster version of it. So that's floating around. And that might be an interesting piece for people because it will show contemporary theological scholars at Westminster talking how Machen's seminal work still influences their thinking today. So that's available, and it's easily gotten through Westminster Seminary. We're glad to make that available.
Great, yeah.
Good stuff.
So those are some ideas anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it.
Yeah, that's some good stuff coming down the pipeline for sure. And this was fantastic talking to you about this book and Machen. The audience is probably super excited to learn more about Machen and how he makes the case for the authority of the Bible, the deity of Christ, and the resurrection, and the core of our Christian faith and apologetics.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and talking about this, Dr. Lillback.
Yeah, it's a tremendous privilege. I pray the Lord will bless your work in a mighty way.
Thank you very much.
One final encouragement. Some have said C.S. Lewis was the great apologist for Christianity, and yet Machen is probably even more effective than C.S. Lewis if you want to have a biblical ring. He has a number of points of integration for the popular defense of the faith, but this is C.S. Lewis for the Reformed tradition.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. We didn't touch too much on that, but yeah, I've read Mere Christianity, which is his audio lectures. Yeah. But yeah, this is Dr. Machen taking C.S. Lewis and putting it Reformed.
Yeah,
it's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Well, blessing you, brothers. Thanks for the honor to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.